Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart. And you will find rest for yourselves, for my yoke is easy and my burden light. These words are taken from this morning's gospel. And Jesus puts together these two virtues in particular, humility and meekness. And they're the two virtues that he actually attributes to himself in the gospel. There's no other place in the gospel where he specifically talks about being a particular virtue or himself manifesting a particular virtue, but with meekness and humility he does. And we know that humility, we pray the litany of humility every day after Mass here at the Chapel of Divine Mercy. It's seeing the truth about yourself as you stand before God. You've heard several definitions of humility from this pulpit. I know Father Lou Caparicio used to say humility is knowing your place and taking it. Knowing your place and taking it. What is the truth about who you are as a husband or a father, mother, wife, and so forth? What is the truth about where you are right now? Knowing your place and taking it. Another definition of humility that I like very much is this one. Humility isn't thinking less about yourself. It is thinking about yourself less. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's thinking about yourself less. You're not even on the little television screen in your mind. So there is again, putting that together with that first definition, seeing the truth about yourself. Where do you fit in life? Where do you fit in the world? And seeing that, God has a plan for you and God has allowed all of these things and God has you working where you are today and he wants you to work out your salvation right there. That's the truth. So understanding the truth about yourself, being authentically humble. Where are you? What is the truth about yourself as you stand before God? Meekness. What is meekness? Borrowing this from Father Hardin's dictionary, Catholic dictionary, meekness is the virtue that moderates anger and its disorderly effects. It is a form of temperance that controls every inordinate movement of resentment at another person's character or behavior. Now, when people hear the word meekness, often I think they associate it with being weak. But remember this, meekness is not weakness. Meekness is not weakness, but it does help to channel the passion of anger or to control that emotional energy we might experience in moments of anger. It guards us against those inordinate movements of anger or resentment. Because we know that anger as a passion in itself, God has given us anger, and it's neither good nor bad in and of itself. What we choose to do with it is where it takes on a moral value. So, anger, God has given us that emotion to recognize when something unjust has happened, when there is a perceived injustice, and anger moves us to try to right that wrong. And so we have to be careful at overreacting or underreacting with regards to anger. And when we see injustices in our life or the lives of others, we absolutely need to be assessed and let the reason kick in and say, okay, what is the appropriate response here? And even in the midst of having, depending on our temperament, we kind of fly off the handle a little bit. We want to let reason catch in, and this takes work to develop that habit, to really bring reason to the table, to think about, okay, is my response right now, is this appropriate? Because we know that St. Paul talks about anger. He says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. So we want to bring that reason and cooperating with God's grace, we want to check that anger. And because we know that even Jesus got angry at times. There's the famous instance of Jesus cleansing the temple. And he is throwing over the tables of the money changers and those selling sacrifices, because they were set up in the court of the Gentiles, where the Gentiles were supposed to be able to come into the temple area to pray, and a bunch of the space was taken up with all of the money changers and the sacrifices being sold. And that upset the Lord, because why? Because the Gentiles were supposed to have a place to come to the temple to pray. And that angered Jesus, that they didn't have that space. So he did not sin in turning over the tables in the temple, but he was righteous in his anger. So there is such a thing as righteous and justified anger. Jesus was angered at the hardness of heart of the Pharisees on the day that he cured the man with the withered hand. He cured the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees who witnessed this accused him of sacrilege, and they said, oh, you're doing a work on the Sabbath, and you're not supposed to do work on the Sabbath. But what is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is for the man, not man for the Sabbath, says Jesus. God gave us the Sabbath to be something that is recreative, to worship him on Sundays, to be restored physically and also spiritually. We set aside time on the Sabbath. And Jesus literally does something recreative. He recreates the man's hand. He makes it fresh. He makes it whole and new on the Sabbath. He's literally, it's a sacramental action there on the Sabbath where he manifests what the Sabbath is for, and in healing the man's hand. And the hardness of the heart of the Pharisees angered Jesus. So there's two instances of our Lord not sinning in any way, but righteous anger is what he manifests. Jesus was really meek. And we want to know that meekness is not weakness. Meekness is not weakness. And so there are things in our lives that are going to anger us, and we do need to let reason kick in. We want to be praying, though, and we want to have identified, is anger unjust, proud anger? Is this a vice in my life? Is prideful anger a vice in my life? And if it is, we want to identify it, and we want to begin attacking that with meekness and humility, because Jesus does not want us to carry that yoke of anger. I'll talk in a moment about things that should upset us, because there are some things that should upset us. But what are the things in my life that this is a yoke that I have taken on myself, that in pride, I'm just carrying this around? Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. He wants us to carry his sweet yoke. And that yoke is meekness and humility, and knowing how to direct that anger and that passion. Because there are things in life that should anger us. And we see them often when we turn the news on with regards to the promotion of the barrage of the promotion of abortion, and a so-called Catholic president who, says he wants to give more money to Planned Parenthood. He hasn't said it this week. I don't know. It's vacation time, though, and so maybe he's a little off his game. But I meant that to be kind of funny, just to kind of, yeah. But it's true. It's scandalous the way that abortion is promoted, the intentional taking of human life. That should anger us. Transition surgeries for minors, and the way that elements of our culture continue to push this. And you see doctors on the news who are saying, oh, this is, going to be good for their emotional health. And I thank God for doctors, and I thank God for therapists and those who are really helping people seek true healing. But there are some doctors out there who are not following the science. And I think the science that they are following is, that word of science is actually spelled with an S that is the $sign, SCIENCE, science, because there's money in it. And that should anger us. Money's not the problem, but the love of money is the root of evil. And the way that is, there is an agenda being pushed there. And so we absolutely want to fight against these trends. And but what is our response in our anger? And so we do need to introduce that and ask God for the grace to be meek and humble of heart in our response. Because again, Jesus puts these two virtues together to fight against what's going on in our own hearts. So we know what's going on in the culture, and how are we responding to that? And in our response, are we overdoing it? If we go online and we respond in a chat room, are we overdoing it? Or then just in our lives in general, kind of looking more at our own, just the way that we conduct ourselves. If anger is a vice for us, are we introducing the use of reason? Are we asking meekness to settle in and to really help to guide that, to guide us in that and with that grace? Because meekness and humility working together are going to combat that inordinate pride and that self-aggrandizing pride. We want to work for good things and we want to remain humble. But when pride slips in, we know how dangerous it is. And, am I mad because of this unjust thing happening, or now am I mad just because I'm carrying on and I'm slamming the door, or I'm giving silent treatment to someone, different manifestations of our anger. So we need to beware of that. I'll give you a good example of pride maybe playing into a manifestation of anger. And God rest his soul, my dad was a very good man, but at times he could get a little angry. And so we were working on the feedlot at home, and many of you know that I grew up raising cattle in western Kansas, and we fed cattle for other customers. And so it was the summer of 1998, and one of my father's customers had purchased a truckload of cattle out of Texas. And it was about a 15-hour truck ride from down in Texas up to our farm in northwest Kansas, where we were going to raise the cattle and fatten them up. And then we would turn them into McDonald's cheeseburgers. That's what we did with cows, prime rib and cheeseburgers. And the cattle were supposed to arrive, the truckload was supposed to arrive about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so myself and my dad, the owner and his hired man, and our hired man, whose name was Stan Baskell, and Stan lived across the road on a pig farm, and one or two other members of my family were there to receive the cattle, and we would feed them and water them and make sure they were taken care of for the day. Well, the appointed time arrives, and the cattle truck still isn't there. And so we're kind of standing around looking at our watches. And Stan notices that there's a truck that has pulled into his farm across the road. Now, Stan takes care of pigs, okay? So there's pig pens over there, and there's 2,000 head of cattle on the other side of the road, on the east side of the county road. So 2 distinct farms. And the truck pulls up, and Stan said, "That's strange. I'm not expecting any trucks today." So he gets into his pickup and he begins to drive over there, and the truck was backing up to his unloading chute. And my dad said, "Something's not right." So we get into he used for short errands, we drove around a Buick LeSabre. It wasn't a pickup truck, it was a 4-door Buick. So we jump in the Buick and we go across the road. And the owner comes over with us. So there's 4 vehicles headed over to Stan's farm. And to our horror, the truck has backed up to the pig pens and he has begun unloading cattle in the pig pens. And my dad, he's very upset. He sees what's going on, and the cattle come off. And pig fencing, if you've ever been around a pig farm, the fence is about that tall. And these cattle have been on the truck for 15 hours, and they come off of there like cruise missiles. I mean, just whoof, whoof. And over the fence they go. So the first 4 that come off, I mean, it's like hurdles, at the local track meet. And away they go. They're running around the pig pens and the farm. And we fortunately prevent the truck drivers from unloading any more. explaining, you're at the wrong farm, you know. So Stan gets the truck over to the Stevens feedlot, and my dad and I are chasing one of these little heifers, and she's about 500 pounds, about that tall, and she's clearly tired of Kansas. She has headed south across a plowed field like she's going to run back to Texas that day. And Dad takes off in the Buick, and the owner is behind us. It looked like the Dukes of Hazzard as we head across this plowed field. And in the car with Dad, I mean, he's hot. He is very, very upset. And we end up, the little heifer ended up getting into a cornfield, and she ended up in one of the neighbors' pastures. And I think we got her back in October or November when we finally retrieved her. So having been defeated there, my dad was very upset. And he speeds back to the farm, and the cattle truck is pulled up to where it should have been 20 minutes earlier. And he's very upset. And just as he slams the car into park, I remember saying to him, "Dad, remember Christian charity." My father throws open the door, and the words that came out of his mouth at that point, I will not repeat because they would have made a sailor blush. And he was very angry. He was very upset. And come to find out, the two truck drivers were stoned or drunk or both. We're not exactly sure, but it was a set of teen drivers. And they thought they had seen the devil incarnate when my dad started walking towards them, shouting at them. And they were terrified. And fortunately, Dad, he got it out and he backed off. We got the animals taken care of, fed and watered. And Dad got the truckers. We had to send a check for the payment for the animals, and we got them on their way. But Dad was upset. And when you think about it, and in thinking back about this, you know, those truckers were very, very irresponsible because they had risked their own lives and the lives of everybody they'd been on the road with. They'd risked the welfare of the cattle, and they'd risked someone else's property. So Dad had every right to be upset. He had every right to be angry. He took it a little too far with the four-letter words, and he was a big enough fella that he was intimidating, and he scared them to death. But again, something unjust had happened, and so to a point, his anger was justified. 2 weeks later, there was another delivery of cattle from the same place in Texas. Interestingly, the truck driver was right on time, and he was very, very polite, and he was very, very competent. And we got the cattle unloaded, and we got them bedded down, and he came into the office where Dad wrote the check, and he handed the man the check, and Dad leaves the office. And I walk out to the truck with the truck driver, and he said, "Sir, there's a story going around South Texas about two truck drivers that nearly died at the hands of a feedlot manager in northwest Kansas. They said he was bigger than an NFL linebacker and meaner than a lion." And he pointed to Dad as he walked away, and he said, "Was that the man?" And I said, "Yeah, Dad was pretty upset that day." And he said, "I see why." And we shook hands, and away he went. Now, the point is this. Dad's anger was over the top. However, his anger was justified to a point, and news got back over 1,000 miles back to whoever it was in Texas that this was unacceptable behavior. And this doesn't float because it's someone else's property. You put the risk of the animal's health, you risk the animal's health. And, you know, you put your own health in risk by those two knuckleheads being drunk and stoned as they drove 100,000 pounds down the road. And so for us, yes, there are going to be things that anger us in life, and they should anger us. But we do have to be praying for that meekness and that humility, because that meekness is going to help channel the anger, and the humility is going to help keep our pride in check so that our anger does not become pride-filled anger. when we go online and we're putting things that we don't like about the whatever. So, pray for meekness before you go online and make comments. Sit on it a day. Let humility kick in as well to keep that pride in check, because Jesus puts these two virtues together for a reason. I am meek and humble of heart. We may know a lot. We may have a lot figured out in life, but we don't know it all. And so we need to keep our pride in check. And we need to do that examination of conscience regularly. And so when and things that anger us, and especially things in the culture that anger us, we need to speak out, absolutely. But to do so in a way that, knowing that we are fighting in a culture that they don't play fair. The deck is stacked against us, and one day some of us may well be martyrs for speaking out against some of the lunacy that goes on culturally. But we want to have spoken out and fought for the truth in a way that is dignified as a Christian. And it's going to take praying for that grace of meekness and humility to be able to do so. And so today we ask Our Lady to intercede on our behalf, that we can follow these directives that Jesus has given us, that we may take up his yoke of meekness and humility, and in following him that way, we will find rest for our souls. Praised be Jesus Christ, now and forever. Amen.